Welcome to those of you who've just joined. We're just waiting for everyone to file into the webinar, and then we'll get going. Okay, so it's just after 10 o'clock. We have almost 120 people online, a few more still to join, but I think we better kick off now. Welcome. My name is Simon Lloyd. I'm Chief Executive of the Royal Forestry Society, which is hosting today's webinar, and also Chair of the Forestry Climate Change Working Group, which is supporting this webinar. I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you for joining. I hope that this proves to be an excellent learning experience. Certainly those who've been on the previous session a couple of weeks ago, we had very, very good feedback. So forest soils cultivation is a very topical topic. We all want to get more trees in the ground, but we need to make sure we all do it right, both for the reputation of the sector, but also to create a lasting legacy that we can all be proud of. And to do that, we nearly all need to evidence our knowledge and skills on forest soils and how to manage them. And so to that end, we're really very lucky to have Jens Haufe here to walk us through the cultivation of forest soils. Jens is not only very knowledgeable and expert on this subject, but also an excellent teacher. And we're also the session is being chaired by Chris Sorensen, who's a woodland resilience officer for the Forestry Commission. And between them, they've run through this webinar now this is their fourth outing. They'll do it very well, and I think you'll have a great morning. And I'm going to leave you now in their very capable hands and hope that you have a good session. Thank you. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you very much for that. And thanks to the RFS for hosting this event as part of the Forestry and Climate Change Working Group. We're very, very grateful for your help. Welcome everyone to what will be a really great technical learning session. Just a very quick and brief intro from me as to why the Forestry Commission in England commissioned Jens to provide this training. Over the last few years, we've been given back our license to plant new forests, and that's for two very urgent reasons. First, the catastrophic decline in biodiversity, which by default indicates we need new native woods, but also the climate change emergency, around which a desire for carbon sequestration has been created. And that means any woodlands, native or exotic. But these woodlands must be created to the UK forestry standard, and with particular reference to these three sections when it comes to soils, you can see on the PowerPoint. There are plenty of people who don't agree with planting trees out there, even native trees, you know, who don't want woodland. So there will be people out there looking for us to fail. We mustn't lose our license to plant. Right. Very quick bit of housekeeping. The webinar's been phenomenally popular, hence why we've added this second event today. I think we're up to 228 people registered. Obviously, some people don't, they prefer to view it afterwards. The downside to that is it means not everyone may get their questions answered. I apologise right at the start about that, but when you've got this many, it's a bit problematic. Please put those questions in the question and answer stream. If you want to just make general observations, can you please use the chat function, but make sure you select all panelists and attendees, otherwise not everyone can see it. If you can keep, the first half will be about soils in general, so the second half will major on cultivation. So if you can keep questions about cultivation till you've seen the second half, because it might answer a lot of them anyway, if that makes sense. We'll have a comfort breaks somewhere halfway through, and Jens can answer any questions on soils or general questions that have come up then. I'll do my best to answer any questions where I can, but I'll relay, if I can't, then I'll relay them to Jens. We'll send out a very short questionnaire in the next day or two and include our draft policy guidance, which is for England only. This is pending a full UKFS practice guide, which hopefully won't be too much longer. Okay, without further ado, let's get into soils. Over to you, Jens.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Right, I hope I have successfully managed to turn your screens largely purple, so that means you are with my presentation. I'll say a couple of words about introducing myself first. My name is Jens Haufe. I got my forest education in Germany, moved to the UK 20 years ago, started working as a forest researcher at Bangor University first, then moved to the then centralized Learning and Development Department of the Forestry Commission, mostly providing silvicultural training, including soils, ground cultivation, tree species selection. And 3 years ago, I changed over to forest research. But yeah, the training somehow followed me. That's why I still deliver routinely quite a lot of modules, and that's why I've been tied into delivering these webinars. Right, what's on the agenda for this webinar? There's 8 points, I think, altogether. I start with a bit historic context, move quickly on to where we are now, touch on UKFS requirements, go to the general needs about why we cultivate soil, and then look at site conditions. So point 5 will take a little bit longer. After point 5, we'll have a comfort break and the first opportunity to ask and answer some questions, and then we move on into cultivation techniques, obviously taking the decision-making process on board, and follow that or finish that off with a general question and answer session. So that should hopefully keep us busy until 12 or so. Right, to start with, on the historic context, the timeline here really shows the history of UK forestry from, well, the creation of the Forestry Commission to the year 2000. From the beginning out, UK forestry was very much production driven. It was all about creating a strategic timber reserve, yet the management practice was very much driven by Mark Anderson's famous principles, meaning that the tree species choice had to match site conditions. And it was, of course, all supported by those days by the lack of technology. Sites had to be walked, and that meant managers, craftspeople understood the site a lot better. They knew exactly what kind of soil they were putting the trees in, and they made according choices in tree species selection. That all changed a bit after the Second World War. The management objective was still largely focusing on production, but the newly available technology simply allowed us to change, to alter the site condition and make it suitable to Sitka spruce or whatever we want to plant. So this quite clearly is the time where we use big plows to convert huge swathes of upland to convert them into the green fleece of spruce forests. We chuck tons of fertilizer onto these. Things have changed again. These days we're looking at sustainable forestry in more than just the production way. We look at multi-purpose forestry, so the environmental and the recreational facet of forest management have become equally important. And it clashes a bit with our, let's say, forestry culture. It is probably fair to say that the forestry sector is still very much focused on the production side of things, or at least part of the forest sector. And that sometimes can seem a bit out of place when we are actually increasing different and changing demands. So obviously it's climate change, carbon sequestration, but we also have added challenges like pests and diseases, structural, operational challenges, which make our life more difficult and which make the entire business of forestry a lot more challenging. So it is quite clear that there will be no repeat of scenarios which we may have had in the 1950s, where we were able to cultivate large areas of upland area by fairly intensive techniques of cultivation. We've learned our lessons, so that was only possible to do over time. So we know now that deep plowing and planting trees on plow furrows, it leads to asymmetric rooting with consequent root and therefore tree stability problems. It also severely affects or limits the future forest operations because of the imposed micro relief on the soil. Climate change makes it a bit doubtful whether this is necessary too, because the problem in the future will be more and more summer droughts rather than waterlogged soil. And we have, of course, the new challenges or the new considerations which we need to take on board. So there's the carbon dioxide release, the realization that soil as a working ecosystem should be left undisturbed as much as possible. Soil erosion, to name but a few, which have been surfaced only fairly recently. What hasn't really changed is the guidance. Bulletin 119, published in the 1990s, is still pretty much the state of the art, the source of our wisdom. So how should we cultivate soils for forestry? Nothing that's said in there is wrong in any sense. What has, of course, changed is the context. So 25 years ago, when this bulletin was written, the focus was still very much on having productive forest stands established as quickly as possible. And that is how the guidance looked at the different techniques and methods. These days, the focus is much more on minimizing the negative side effects on the environment. So the goalposts have shifted. And that requires us to look at traditional guidance and critically review it, because what used to be the very best option 30 years ago, maybe these days is only the second or the third best option in the light of the environmental impact on the soil. So what have we really achieved? The picture on the left-hand side, 1980s ground cultivation, it's quite obvious that should be a thing of the past. Deep plowing, a very peaty soil. You can imagine these days where we all worked up about carbon dioxide release, that is no longer acceptable. On the right-hand side, that picture is only 7 years old, and you could probably ask, well, have we really improved our forest practice? Clearly, the plow furrow is not as deep on the right-hand side, but it is just as peaty. You can see some glade mineral glimpsing through. It is on a steep slope. You can also question whether actually the plow ridges here are actually suitable for planting. So it's not always evident that forest practice has actually kept pace with our increased knowledge of environmental impacts of cultivation. To start with the overarching topic of greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide, just a few facts and figures to run past you. Greenhouse gases, it's of course not only carbon dioxide, there are other agents involved as well. Methane, to name the first, actually 28 times as damaging to the environment as carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxides, 265 times as bad. Hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride are the other ones. The first three are really the most important ones for as far as forestry is concerned, because they are all affect the environment and have an impact on climate change, global warming in a different way. They're usually converted into carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the CO2e standing for. So we need to be careful when we think about how much emissions, how much greenhouse gases do we release in the atmosphere. It needs to be brought to a comparable basis, and that's carbon dioxide equivalent. Still, carbon dioxide, even so, accounts for 86% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So it is clearly the most important one. It's also clear that forests are not the only, but a big part of the solution. Forests generally accumulate carbon up to an equilibrium point, and the accumulation can be quite considerable. There's the figures further down, 15 tons carbon dioxide per year and hectare. That is a bit of an average ballpark figure. You can imagine that it will be different for a yield class 24 Sitka spruce to a yield class 6 oak forest, but it's not quite as simple because it also depends on how big the trees, how old the trees are already. And of course, the other question is, for how long is the carbon being stored? So the final product needs to be considered here as well. The carbon stock of the UK, the estimate is something like 3,800 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Most of it, almost 3/4, is actually kept in the soil, and only up to a third is in the biomass. Point 2, it mentions the equilibrium point. I need to be clear here, there is eventually, once a forest gets into the balance of as much timber is growing, as much is dying and decaying, this is the equilibrium point. So this is certainly not within our economic rotations. This is comes at a far later stage, when we're really talking about old growth forests at a very advanced stage. So the undisturbed Amazonian rainforest, you could say that's at equilibrium, which has never been touched by humans. So for most of our forests, this is really shouldn't be used as an argument for short-term rotation and early harvesting. Right, the whole carbon cycle is put here in that rather fancy chart. So obviously the starting point being down here at the right-hand side, growing trees, storing carbon. As I mentioned already, a lot of that goes into soil. Some of it goes into wood, and the wood is obviously then harvested, turned into wood products. And this is where it matters. Does it go into pulp or paper, which is a very short-term storage? Does it go into construction grade, joinery grade timber, which is much more long-term storage? So even forestry, you can't say forestry per se is stores carbon, a certain amount of carbon. It depends what you make out of your forest products. But the topic for today is really cultivation. So we are focusing on replanting, or in afforestation terms, planting up open land to get the forest started in the first place. If we look at the UKFS guidelines and scan them for carbon sequestration, or carbon loss rather, we'll find, yeah, alone on this page, it appears 3 times, and it can be quite clearly linked to ground disturbance, to soil erosion, and to disturbance and erosion of organic matter. So all of these are very much linked to ground cultivation. If you think soil erosion, normal forestry practice, unless you count some marginal scarification during harvesting processes, doesn't really happen. So the most of it, and deliberately, happens during cultivation. The same goes for erosion, which is knock-on effect of the disturbance. And the same is also true for the organic matter, which is mostly affected by cultivation processes. So in order to look into more detail in that, we firstly need to be clear about what are we actually talking about when we talk about soil. What seems to be a fairly solid matter is only to 50% solid. So half of the soil is actually made of gases, air, and water. The other half is mostly mineral, to some degree organic. It depends, of course, what soil we talk about. So what is in there that our trees need, or that is relevant for forest management, for forest establishment? The nutritional elements are mostly present in the mineral component. Some of them are, of course, in the organic component because they have been recycled. The organic component, however, is the only source of carbon. So straight away, if we think carbon sequestration or carbon storage in soil, we think about the organic component, not the mineral one. And that also makes it clear that we can't look at all the soils in the same way. It should be very obvious from the two pictures which one has actually the higher carbon content. So it's simply no good to come up with a one-size-fits-all recipe. Soils need to be looked at in a site-specific way, and often we have more than one soil type on site. So we can't say, well, don't cultivate, don't plow, don't mound, don't do X, Y, and Z. It always matters, well, what soil are we talking about? Because that actually determines how important cultivation is with respect to carbon dioxide release. On top of the carbon, we have, of course, the soil as a working ecosystem. There's estimates that we have up to 25 tons in a hectare of topsoil, so 25 tons of living organism. That includes everything from fungal mycelium to small animals to very small ones, so bacteria, actinomycetes, so things we can't see with the naked eye anymore. 25 tons is a fair amount. I think topsoil they defined here by definition, that's the top 30 centimeters, so not very deep at all. And we need to be very clear as foresters, this is indeed a working ecosystem. So there are all kinds of processes, synergies happening there, which are in balance and in flow, and which we hardly understand how exactly they work. And therefore we hardly understand what consequences, what deeper and more far-reaching consequences our cultivation actions may actually have on the soil. Just think about a mycorrhiza, for example. That is vital for trees to actually pick up nutrients in the soil. So the moment you cultivate, you throw the mycorrhiza completely out of balance. It has to re-establish itself. The same actually goes for clear felling. So there is a lot to be said for also trying to really minimize disturbance, just because we are disturbing something that actually is designed to work very well to make trees grow, and that we probably we may improve some aspects for tree growth, but we are never going to improve the whole picture for trees. And I'm going to elaborate a bit more on that, looking at this secondary succession chart. Never mind the burning tree. That could be the clear fell scenario, where we then say, yeah, we leave it fallow for a couple of years and then replant. But this is what normally would happen in our temperate climate, and particularly in the rain-rich climate of the UK. We have actually perfect conditions for tree growth. So most of our natural habitats, if left undisturbed, they would actually end up as or being dominated by trees. Most ecosystems, we would have some kind of woodland. It would take some time to establish itself, and it would obviously go through several phases. So as you can see here, so up to 4, 5, possibly a lot more years, we will have weeds first, perennial plants later on, followed by shrubs, eventually by something which we may call pioneer, then intermediate species. You have your conifers up here, and eventually dominated by climax species. So there's actually no need for us to interfere, or let's rather say the need for us to interfere is our ambition to have productive forests there a bit quicker than, let's say, 100 or 150 years. So what we are trying to do, we're trying to jump from here to this phase in a few years, 5 at most. Then we actually want to have an established forest of a productive stand on site. And it could be rightly asked whether our main bread and butter species, Sitka spruce, it's an intermediate species. So it's not really designed to establish itself easily on open ground, whether we are possibly a bit too impatient here, and whether we are trying to achieve too much, whether it's really strictly necessary that we have the stand established after 3, 4, or 5 years, or whether we could afford to say, well, it may take a bit longer for the planted trees to come out of the weeds. We may have to do weeding and certainly monitoring for a little longer. But the benefit we get in exchange for that is that we do less damage to the soil as the basic ecosystem which forms the foundation of our established forest. Right, after this more general consideration, I'm moving on to really the rationale for cultivating soil, and is quite clear. We're not going to stop cultivating tomorrow. There will still be cases where we say, no, cultivation is absolutely necessary. And the 4 main reasons are really highlighted here. Weed competition is the first one. There will always be scenarios where we say, nah, if we don't deal with the weeds, the trees will not succeed. They will simply fail. Soil aeration, basically the imbalance between water and air in the soil, that is something that may have to be addressed on some soil. Providing nutrients for transplants, basically remineralizing the humus layer, which contains the nutrients accumulated by the previous stand, and breaking compacted soil layers, i.e. iron pans or plow pans in some cases may also be necessary. There are more reasons why we would cultivate a soil, but these are really the ones which are essential. These are the ones why we say that is necessary that we cultivate, otherwise our management objectives are at risk. Everything else, like imposing order on site, making or facilitating subsequent operations, they are welcome side effects, but they're not really essential. So when we think about what cultivation we might have to do, the guiding principles should always be that we have to work within the limitations of the site. Cultivation cannot really alter the site conditions permanently and profoundly. So if a soil or site is waterlogged, the only real solution is that to pick a tree species which can live with that, which will thrive in those conditions, rather than trying to drain it, make it drier, and put something on it that's really not adapted to the inherent site conditions. The second challenge is the variability of sites. We very often find that we have 2, 3, sometimes more soil types on one site, which means that we can't have one prescription. Again, there's no one size fits all recipe where we say, oh, we just plow this or we mount this and that will sort the soil issues out. Third one is weighing up the short-term benefits of cultivation against the more longer-term effects. This is kind of linked to what I said about this succession diagram. I would say, yeah, cultivation certainly It gives trees a boost, it gives them a leg up to get established, but it may also have long-term effects which are not intended, which could actually be negative, and which might well bite us back in the future, but which we choose to ignore because we think too short term. We just often think, well, within 5 years, I need to cash in my grants, and therefore the stand needs to be established. And the last point, preferring less intensive techniques. Well, what it says here in the point, trees regenerate naturally without cultivation after all, not necessarily without disturbance, but it's always good to bear that in mind, that cases where cultivation is absolutely needed are rare. It's the need to cultivate is largely driven by our ambition to achieve a certain land use, get a forest established within a certain time frame. Right, finally, before we get to the decision-making process, a word about drainage and cultivation. They're often seen as interlinked, yet there is a danger that drainage or cultivation is really not a substitute for drainage. And when we think about drainage, one of the things that really should very conscious in our mind is that forests are first and foremost water storage facilities. And we've only recently had issues with flooding again. And forests provide a large part of the solution there, but of course not if we try to dry out the forest, if we reduce the water storing capacity of the forest. So we should consider forests as what they are. They're kind of sponges which are helping us to mitigate peak flows and regulate water flow. So we should use drainage responsibly in a way to manage the water flow, but not really to dry out sites. And referring to the picture on the right, you see trees here planted on plow ridges and plow lines actually running straight downhill. That's what I meant when I said cultivation is really not a substitute for drainage. So don't try to use cultivation techniques to address drainage issues, like to provide a small, well-drained microsites for fast tree establishment. That is a very temporary solution, and it doesn't really, it gives you kind of false security that actually the site might be suitable for the species you have planted, where in reality it isn't. Right, and with that, we are really moving to the decision-making process. So when we think about cultivation, the first step should always be identify the soil types and choose the appropriate tree species. Soil types, they're often looked at in this fairly convenient yet a bit simplistic matrix. So we've got the soil fertility across the top, so usually expressed in soil nutrient regime, and the moisture of the soil on the left, soil moisture regime, and all our soil classes, soil groups, soil types, they fit more or less neatly into that matrix. The real picture is not quite as simple. It's of course not a box-shaped matrix. It is a continuum of slowly changing soil conditions, but by and large, this is what the picture looks like. And the first thing, sorry if I'm repeating myself, the first thing to remember is that no cultivation can compensate for choosing the wrong or a tree species which is not adapted to the inherent site conditions. So if it's something that is not drought resistant, well, I shouldn't put that on a droughty soil, and vice versa. And the second point really relates more to what I said, the matrix on the left. It's a bit simplistic. So most of our decision support systems which we have in place, they look at soil nutrient and soil moisture regime, but there are of course other characteristics as well. There is soil texture, there's rootable depth, there is soil structure, so there is slope, there are other external factors which I look at. at the end of this presentation. So to start with, we really need to be clear about identifying our soils, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to take you through a very fast forward review of our most common forest soils, starting with glaze. Glaze are characterized by waterlogged topsoil and subsoil. So the soil layering, it's usually we have an A, B, C pattern, A being the topsoil, B the subsoil, C the underlying parent material of which the soil is formed through weathering processes, and glaze are simply characterized by the fact that both topsoil and subsoil, they have too much water, not enough air, so they're more or less waterlogged. They may have an organic layer, but that is an option. And the organic layer on a glaze soil is never more than 5 centimeters. The freely draining equivalent to glaze is the brown earth, following the same pattern, only this time both topsoil and subsoil are free draining. The organic matter, organic layer, again, it is optional. And if it is, it's no more than 5. If it is present, it's no more than 5 centimeters thick. If it's thicker, then we are technically not speaking about the brown earth anymore. It gets a bit more colorful here when we move to potholes. So there's obviously more interesting stuff going on. The horizons diversify a bit. To start with, potholes usually have an organic layer, and it can be up to 45 centimeters thick. It's raw humus, rarely peat, it is really raw humus. Underneath that, we have the A, B, C, only the A is subdivided into an A and E. So the topsoil is still freely draining, and the E is what makes it so characteristically bleak, bleached. Underneath that, we have the subsoil, which is pronounced orange color and usually, well, not usually, always freely draining. So potholes quite clearly freely draining soil. A kind of sidekick, if you want to say so, of the pothole is an iron pan soil. It originates by the same processes, and like a pothole, it has up to organic layer, up to 45 centimeters organic layer, and this could now be raw humus or peat on top. And differently to the pothole, the topsoil is waterlogged. The waterlogging is due to this little BF horizon, which is the actual iron pan layer, which is very often only a couple of millimeters, and it can be more or less pronounced. So benign iron pan soils, we call them integrate iron pan. The iron pan layer, it's there, so it's enough to slow the water down. So yes, your topsoil is a bit waterlogged, but it's not really impeding root growth. The serious ones, the iron pan actually does prevent tree rooting at greater depth, but what they all have in common, iron pan soils, they're actually freely draining because the subsoil is freely draining, yet the topsoil is waterlogged because the water percolation is hampered by the presence of that iron pan. Then we have peaty glaze. They obviously originate from glaze, only this time they have a peat layer on top. It can be as little as 5, it can be as much as 45 centimeters according to the UK forest soil classification. And again, topsoil and subsoil are both waterlogged. And that is the main soil groups. I've spared the organic soil, so obviously everything with more than 45 centimeters on peat or raw humus on top, we classify as a peat. So all in all, we have a forest soil classification in place. And although I think the official title is FC soil classification, it is the only one there is for forestry in the UK. So you may or may like it, or you may not like it. This is the one we are all using, or we should all be using, because there is no alternative, and there shouldn't be an alternative because it has been put in place, it has been developed for a reason, for a purpose, and it fits that purpose actually very well. So forest soil classification, we are looking at 7 soil classes. So there are 2 with well-aerated subsoil and another one with poorly aerated subsoil. Then we have 2 organic ones. So that's the main soil classes. That's our mineral soils and our peat soils. And then we have 3 minor soil classes underneath that. That's the man-made soils, the rankers and skeletal soils, and the littoral soils. But usually, well, the name suggests, the main soil classes are the most common one. We can then subdivide them into 15 soil groups. So the well-aerated soils, they include the brown earth, the potholes, the iron pan soils, and the calcareous soils. So that's numbers, there's the first 4, they're not numbered 1 to 4. I'll say a bit more about the numbering. The poorly aerated subsoils or the waterlogged soils, they obviously have the glaze, groundwater glaze, surface water glaze, and peaty surface water glaze, and that is basically the mineral soils dealt with. We then have the organic soils, flushed peatlands and unflushed peatlands. And our 3 minor soil classes, man-made, rankers, and skeletals. So there's our 15 soil groups. Yeah, never mind the numbering. This is how they have been numbered when the soil classification has been developed. You may think, well, that's not very logical, but that is what we have with, and we've been using them with that system for 50 years and to good effect. So it is not something that is unsurmountable. After soil groups, we can then actually go further down into soil types. So brown earth, for example, there's a typical brown earth, we have a basic brown earth, an upland brown earth, and a podzolic brown earth. So soil group brown earth actually subdivides into 4 soil types. And I'm stopping here because otherwise I would turn that into a training session into soils, which is certainly not the intention. But it's just to give you an idea how detailed it goes. And when I say soil is not the same soil everywhere, then this is what I mean. We have all in all 50 soil types. And to make it even more interesting, we have supplemented them by 14 soil phases. Now, soil phases, they can be allocated to mineral soils only. And again, they have been invented for a reason, and the reason really is to inform the forester about certain soil characteristics which are of silvicultural relevance for management, mostly for tree species selection. The phases are usually characterized by little suffixes. Again, I'm just giving you a couple of examples. If you put in a little C to one of these soil types, it means it's a cultivated soil. And the idea is that you use this to inform the forest manager that the soil has been considerably altered in its physical or chemical properties by the former agricultural use. And for a lot of afforestation sites, that is likely to apply. And likewise, a little P stands for peaty. And you hopefully remember that 5 minutes ago I said soils like glaze and brown earth, they may or may not have an O layer, so a humus layer on top. That's exactly what the P is about, to inform the user of a soil map whether this O layer is there. It's not uniformly classified, so depending on the soil type, so a pothole and a groundwater clay, the presence or the required thickness to qualify the soil for a PT suffix or a PT face is a different one than for surface water glaze or for iron pan soils. But that's by the by. Right, once we are happy with the soil classification, we need to look into soil mapping. So that is an essential prerequisite for sustainable forest management, to know what soils you're dealing with. I've given you a little example here on the left. For those of you who are interested, the water body on the left-hand side, that's Kielder Water, so you have an idea where you are in the country. And you see those soil polygons which have all been labeled here. By convention, the minimum size of a soil polygon should be 0.5 hectare. So if you find that's the kind of resolution you get with standard soil maps. If there's any soil features which are smaller than 0.5 hectare, they can be put into square brackets, but then that's an indication that it's a local feature and it may not be accurately mapped. The other thing that is obviously obvious from the soil map is that you can have more than one soil type in any one polygon. So soil surveying, as you can imagine, can be a very tedious business of just giving you how many soil types we have, and you can imagine the sheer size of the area. How many soil pits can you realistically dig? So you are actually forced to lump together soils, and you can actually put up to 3 into one polygon if they're not too different, or if they're too difficult to map separately. And again, it's essential when you look at these maps, and you have examples here. So there are little green bits which have just 9B, so you know that's some kind of bog, but then you have a 9D/6P. So that obviously is a kind of bog, but there's also some peaty clay in there, and you have others where you have actually 3 soil types. And in order to be clear about the meaning, you have to be familiar with the rules and terms and conventions. So I thought it's probably best to explain that quickly on an example. If you imagine just looking at soil types 4B, which is an integrated iron pan, 6P, which is a peaty clay, and 9D, which is a Molinia bog, so a peaty soil. If your map really just shows the 4B, by convention, the soil surveyor has concluded this is at least 85% iron pan. There could be 15% which are not specified, but a responsible soil surveyor would say, yeah, this is certain, this polygon, which I've put on the map, that has 85% is iron pan, and there may be little bits and bobs of something else in there which are too difficult to track down and can't be mapped reasonably. So the confidence level is actually 85%. If there's 2 soil types in there, so now iron pan and peaty clay, the order depends. So the one before the slash is the more dominant one, so at least 50%, up to 3/4 of iron pan, up to 50% of peaty clay, still 15% unspecified. If the second soil type is in brackets, it means it's even less dominant, so up to 25%. So still on an 85% confidence level, but you need to look at these symbology and the soil maps to identify, well, what kind of soil am I dealing with? And as you expect, it gets more interesting if we have 3 soil types in the mix. So now here, the iron pan and the peaty clay are joined by a proper deep peat. In the original, so just the 3 soil types separated by slashes. So the first 2 are actually with the same value, 30 to 40%. The last one is less, 20 to 40%. And also important to remember, the unspecified proportion of the soil now drops to 0. The assumption being that if a soil surveyor goes to the effort to identify 3 soil types, and it is expected, well, that explains every or 100% of the polygon area. So there's nothing left to chance. Things change again with the introduction of brackets. So the next example with the deep peat in brackets limits it again to less than 25%, and also the proportion between the main and the second soil type changes. And if we have the second and the third soil type in brackets, they are both limited to less than 25%. So unless you're aware of that, you can't really assess what kind of soil, how much of soil you have in an area you wish to cultivate. So understanding the forest soil classification and understanding soil mapping is the first step to be clear about, yeah, what do I have actually on site? What kind of cultivation is the right to choose? But before we go there, there should be a little intermediate step, and that is considering if cultivation is needed at all. And again, I'm just showing you a picture here, which is clearly an afforestation scheme. Someone has opted for oak cluster planting. Very good silvicultural concept, and they decided, oh no, it needs mounded. The soil is quite clearly brown, so freely draining brown earth. Why do we need mounds? It's very often cultivation is seen as a default solution, and it's a bit of a legacy we've probably dragged over to forestry from farming, where we say, no, without cultivating, trees can't possibly grow on their own. They can. So no cultivation is the least intensive, and therefore from an environmental point of view, always the most preferable option. So that definitely should be given some thought. Do we need to cultivate at all? If we decide yes, we do, then we need to be clear about the soil-based objectives for the cultivation. And this brings us back to our soil matrix. The different soils, they can kind of group together, and I've put them together with the four main objectives for cultivation. So brown earth, you can kind of look at them in one big box and say, yeah, brown earth, aeration should be fine, they're freely draining soil, nutrients should be fine, reduce weed competition. That is possibly the main issue you may have to address in a brown earth. In an iron pan soil, it's obviously the last point, breaking the compacted soil layer to the iron pan in order to make your topsoil freely draining. Potholes, very nutrient poor, freely draining, so probably providing nutrients is what you should focus on. Surface water glaze, they overlap with iron pan soils, which makes it a bit more problematic. So in the hatched area, you probably have to address more than one thing. Obviously, if it's waterlogged, improving soil aeration is the issue. In an iron pan, then breaking the compacted soil layers may be an issue. Peaty glaze, obviously waterlogging on the poorer end, providing nutrients is an issue. Deep peats, if we cultivate them at all. So obviously there are special considerations that need to go in there, rankers and skeletal soils. So what is now the right choice for each of these? Starting with the glaze again. They are, well, as I said earlier on, they are waterlogged, but again, there is quite a range. That goes from moist via very moist to wet and to wet. So there's a bit of a range glaze cover. So the driest glaze, which are just moist, they are so-called brown glaze. So they're actually quite close. They actually connect to the brown earth. So the waterlogging is hardly worth mentioning. And the same goes for fertility. The glaze can be anything from poor to very rich. Now, admittedly, forestry usually deals with the poor or very poor, sometimes the medium fertility glaze. But it's not that the glaze by default is something poor. Trees or issues for tree establishment is clearly the waterlogging, so which may limit root growth of the trees. Weed competition on the more fertile glaze. More long-term is shallow rooting, but that should only affect you if you have picked the tree species which is not suited to the inherent site conditions. So ground cultivation should address these issues by improving the soil aeration. So improving the balance between water and air in the soil where necessary. Bear in mind what I just said at the beginning of this slide. So the driest glaze, the brown glaze, you don't need to do much in terms of aeration now, almost brown earth. And the other point may be weed competition, but again, where necessary. If it's not a very fertile clay where weed competition is not life-threatening to the established or to the trees, you can actually do without cultivation. Right, on brown earth, the moisture is from moist, so they, as I said, they connect to the brown glaze, but they go right up to moderately dry. Fertility-wise, sometimes people think brown earth are at least medium or usually rich. That's not true. They can be poor. They can go to very rich, but a lot of brown earth we deal with in forestry are actually of poor fertility. So issues for tree establishment, really, it's weed competition, but that is only true on the very fertile brown earth. A side effect is grass sorts may be a suitable habitat for some forest pests, such as voles, that can be addressed by other issues than cultivation. Long-term issues, there are virtually none. Brown earth, we're lucky when we get a brown earth for forest management. So consequently, cultivation, really dealing with weeds where and if necessary, that is the only issue that cultivation may have to address. Other than that, there's not really an issue why we need to go in and cultivate. On potholes, which are moderately dry to fresh, they're all very poor to poor, so, and more likely very poor. So the issues for tree establishment, they're often droughty. They usually have a rather sandy texture, and the vegetation is often dominated by heather, and that can make planting difficult. Other than that, the long-term issues is really low fertility. So you don't get a very high yield class on the pothole, and you don't get the full range of tree species to plant there. So cultivation should therefore aim to provide nutrients, and that is most easily done by mixing organic with mineral soil. That speeds up nutrient recycling and makes nutrients available to the next generation of trees. You may have to deal with the vegetation, not so much because it's a competition of the trees, but because it's an obstacle to planters. So if the site really is covered by a dense sort of heather, then that needs to be out of the way. Otherwise, your planters won't be able to, or will only be able with great difficulty to put the trees in. Iron pan soils, they are a bit wetter than the potholes, fresh to moist. Fertility-wise, they're in the same ballpark, so very poor to poor. They tend to be on the better end of very poor. The texture-wise, they are more loamy, rather less sandy than potholes. And as I said, the decisive characteristic for an iron pan was the waterlogged topsoil. That may be an issue for root growth. Vegetation, same thing applies as for potholes, the heathery vegetation, which could making planting very difficult. Strong iron pan soils, they come with a really dangerous issue for long-term growth and stability. If the iron pan is really strong enough to prevent root growth, then you will never get deep rooting on that site, which obviously is not something we want to see. Unstable trees, unstable stands. So the objectives for cultivation really should be to prevent the iron pan, which will improve the drainage and which will facilitate rooting. So basically by breaking the iron pan, you almost address all the other issues. Mixing of organic soil with mineral soil, that will benefit nutrient recycling and removal of the heathery vegetation to make the job easier for the planters. I've tried to illustrate that here, coming up with a simplified profile. I hope you remember this. The black peat or raw humus layer, then the waterlogged topsoil, the iron pan, and the free draining subsoil. Trench mounding obviously doesn't do anything because your iron pan remains largely in place. Hinge mounding, if you do that, you do create a better planting medium, but eventually the tree roots still have to penetrate the iron pan, which they may be well capable of doing. The best solution, however, is inverted mounding, because what you do by inverted mounding, if you punch through the iron pan, you create a drainage hole and you actually establish the trees at the very same position. So basically your drainage hole for the waterlogged soil, for the excess water in the topsoil, is actually at the very tree planting position. So you may not have a very tall mound, but you have drained the mound by punching or puncturing the iron pan soil, which has a much better and much longer lasting effect. And the tree roots can follow. Right, for peaty glaze, they are now on the moist to very wet moisture range. Fertility, very poor to medium, so they're very few really rich peaty glaze, and if they are, then yeah, forestry never get their hand on them. Tree establishment is a different one here. We have a raw humus or a peat layer on top, which is relatively nutrient rich because it usually contains all the organic matter from the previous stand, which has fallen down by litter, which is also a very soft texture, so rooting is reasonably easy. And that organic layer overlies the mineral soil, which is often dense, sometimes clay, and which is difficult to root, and even from a nutrient perspective doesn't put much of an incentive for tree roots to go there. So rooting is an issue, and of course so is waterlogging. If it's too wet for the tree species you've chosen, then yeah, they won't root properly. The longer term issue, that's also a dangerous one, because if you do get shallow rooting, then that has long-term effects on tree stability. So cultivation should therefore do two things: create a favorable rooting medium, so mixing organic and mineral layer, basically making sure that the tree roots can grow into a healthy mixture of mineral and organic, and improve soil aeration. Reducing weed competition where necessary, but that is usually not the case. Peaty glaze are rarely that fertile that we have to address this. Again, I've tried to show that in a little animation. So there's a spruce, a normal spruce root system. We know spruce is a flat rooting species, but it grows sinker roots, which should go vertically down and add stability and provide nutrient uptake. What happens in peaty glaze, those sinker roots, they stall when they hit the boundary between peat and mineral soil. They're simply, as I said, there's no incentive for them to get any deeper. It's too dense, it's too cold, it's too wet, and it's not even fertile enough. So I also have to be clear, this doesn't show above ground. So the yield class will be the same. What it does negatively affect tree stability. I've tried to illustrate that here. Both photos were taken on the same site, but on the left-hand picture, you have a Sitka spruce stump, which had been rooting in an integrated iron pan. So you can see from felling cuts, the sinker roots, the tap roots, they are way over a meter into the soil, so no problem here. On the right-hand side, that was part of the site which was characterized by a peaty glaze, and you see exactly those short tap roots, which haven't really gone very far. So the main roots have stayed very close to the surface as they would in Sitka spruce, but then the rooting has simply stalled just where they hit the boundary, because the roots just didn't grow over into the mineral soil. And again, if we think about possibly cultivation techniques, hinge mounding, trench mounding, well, trench mounding won't change much. Hinge mounding is not likely to change anything either. If you make a hinge mound, you do provide a better rooting medium, true, but eventually your roots still end up in the peat layer and they still end up at that barrier. And it doesn't really matter where you plant the tree, whether on top of the mound or whether on the shoulder of the mound. An inverted mound, which fills that hole where the borrow pit, where the soil has been taken from, it would provide presumably the same rooting medium, favorable because it contains both of the best of both worlds. It wouldn't have that additional drainage effect, which we had in an iron pan soil, but what it would do, it would prevent more gradual change from a mixed rooting medium to a mineral soil only rooting medium. So there is, at least for the roots immediately underneath the stump, they have it much easier. It's not such an abrupt change for them to go from something very soft, reasonably fertile and easy to penetrate, i.e. the peat, into something very compact, the mineral soil. And finally, rankers, rancinas, skeletal soils. I think common sense dictates here that they should not be cultivated. If we only have 30 centimeters as a maximum of rootable soil depth available to us, we should not mess around with that at all. So trees can sort that out. Trees are quite good at rooting even into the parent layer if unless it's too dense, so these soils should be excluded from cultivation anyway. Right, and with that, and just 1 minute behind schedule, I think we have reached the point where we have a first comfort break. I think the idea is having 10 minutes comfort break, and you can use the time to post your first questions on the chat. As Chris said earlier on, don't put any questions there which really go on to best practice about cultivation methods, because we are going to cover that in part 2. So mostly this is for the soil related questions. So I'll see you back in 10 minutes.
Don't know if we want to, I hope everyone's back, made a cup of tea, what have you. You're still on mute, Jens.
Okay.
There's a few questions there. They're coming in thick and fast, Jens. I mean, the first one from Colin. Hopefully you can see some of the answered ones. So we're trying to answer them as we've been going along. Colin Hawke, you seem to be suggesting that we return to Anderson's principles. You know, the 1950s book. I think the answer to that is fairly simple. Yes.
Yeah.
It's a more holistic approach, isn't it? I suppose right tree in the right place.
I think it's not just the back to the Anderson's principles, the right tree in the right place. I think another step we also have to make, and not so much with carbon, but with pests and diseases and climate change, for risk mitigation, we'll have to go for mixtures. So it's not just saying, oh yes, we can no longer have Corsican pine, so we substitute it with some other, with Macedonian pine or with radiata pine. This is not going to work. We'll have to substitute, or we have to change our approach to from even-aged monocultures to mixed forests and more structurally diverse forests, just to mitigate the risk with regard to, well, climate change, but also the secondary risk, pests and diseases.
Yeah. Colin Hawke, possibly for one to answer afterwards, but surely the cultivated area of inverted mounds is very small in relation to the mature rooting area, so only a short-term benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. This is the mound is a start-up benefit, and the root system needs to grow and will grow far beyond the mound. There's no doubt about that. The mound is really there to create a favorable microsite, so a bit of micro drainage, slightly warmer but mostly drier soil conditions. And the mound is not the solution for everything. The mounds have come to that. They have negative long-term side effects as well.
It's an establishment technique, isn't it?
Yeah.
Chris Reed asked a question. I think this is John might answer this one, Jens. Some recent evidence suggests cultivation and tree planting on peaty soil shallower than 50 centimetres can release more carbon than is locked up over decadal timescales. What's your view on this? Do we need a change to the UKFS on this point?
Well, do you want me to come in on that, Chris?
Yeah. I was just going to say, I answered a similar question saying FC won't approve planting on deep peats greater than 50 centimetres, but I know.
I think at the moment we all have to accept there's an awful lot of reviewing going on about organic soils, which is one of the reasons, of course, that we're running this webinar at the moment, because we do think a good amount of thought should be given to organic soils, and it shouldn't just be a presumption that 50 centimetres. I think it's very political at the moment, and I think I would be saying to people, that is the current UKFS guidelines, and I don't want to prejudge anything that's going to be coming down the line, possibly in the next month, the next year.
Okay, thank you. Simon Maskery, I did answer your question, Simon, but I see if Jens agrees. Is there a source for soil maps readily available to an independent forester, or are we likely to have to get out there with a spade and dig our own soil pits? I gave a link to Soilscapes, Jens, but the warning is it's very, very broad. You need to dig soil pits, basically, but I'm interested in your opinion as well. Yeah,
there will be maps available, but they will not follow the UK forest soil classification. But I have to say, the UK, when you think about classifying soils, there are 2 or 3 big schools worldwide. So there's the Americans have their own approach and the Europeans have a different one. And they are kind of overarching systems, how you classify soils, and forestry or whatever land use doesn't really matter. And within Europe, we really have a standardized system, and the UK forest soil classification fits quite neatly in there, as would be the French soil classification and the German and the Russian. They're all based on the same principle. So if you find a soil map issued by, I don't know, Ordnance Survey or James Hutton Institute, or geological maps, there are various soilscapes, there are various sources out there. They will not come with the same numbering system I've shown, but they will come up. They will very broadly use the very same terms, like brown forest soils, which you need to translate, well, that is a brown earth. And terms like podzolic soils, iron pan soils, it will not be a one-to-one translation to the FC soil classification, but it will be very similar. If you understand the system, you will be able to use it. But the main problem is that it's the quality of surveying. And you see that if you use online map browsers, which again, forestry commission staff have available, the area between, a lot of it has been surveyed, but it's on a much coarser resolution than the ones. So I'm afraid that For most areas, yes, you'll have to take your spade and have a look and at least ground truth. But I would always consult a map before, so you have a bit of an idea about the underlying geology and you know what to expect.
Great, thank you. Kate Lufwaite asks, I wonder in practice how many people are using no cultivation techniques at present. For example, are any of those present on the webinar today using it where appropriate? Well, perhaps, you know, if people want to respond to Kate in the chat function, I mean, most of the creation sites I see in Devon, Kate, are no cultivation. But they're on a much smaller scale than these big upland Cumbrian sites, etc. So very little, occasionally ripping. You do see a bit of ripping on X pasture, and again, Jens will go into ripping in the second half. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Jens.
Well, no cultivation techniques are being used. I've got, I live in Dumfries Galloway, close to Scottish borders, and I have woodland establishment schemes, but for native woodlands on very, where you would say, well, very hostile and poor peaty glaze, where species like birch, oak, and hawthorn have just been flat planted. And they're not rocketing away, but they're surviving now the third year running. So it is definitely possible. It is our obsession with productive forests and the required high yield class that makes us think, oh no, unless we cultivate, the trees will take ages to grow out of the weeds. So it's perfectly possible. We are just, we are not prepared to wait. I think that is the real issue.
Yeah. John's answered a few questions, by the way. If you look in the answered tab on the Q&A, Lee Hollins, which would you say was the lesser evil? Use of herbicide to create a planting position on suitable soils or ground prep? This comes up every time, Lee, so good question. Thanks for asking it.
Yeah, I think it depends on the scale, and it depends on the soil. So, as I said, if it is an unfertile, or let's say a freely draining brown earth, my preference would actually be using a scarification technique to get rid of the weeds, because, well, I'm not going to release much carbon. Whereas if it was something with a raw humus layer on top, I say, well, I'd rather not disturb that too much. I think herbicide might be the better option, but obviously I'm just as uneasy about herbicide use as I am about big soil disturbance. So it's, yeah, it is a difficult one. But I don't think there will be one blanket answer that will apply in all cases.
No. There was a question from Shona that John's answered, but it has come up again. I'm only repeating it because it comes up continually. Is guidance available on matching standard FC soil categories from the field guide to those used for ESC soil inputs? Somewhat different terms used. I can adjust with phases, but I'm never 100% confident I'm doing this appropriately. I mean, Jens was just discussing earlier, I have downloaded the ESC field survey pack. Is that worth just mentioning?
Well, I'm a bit astonished at this question, because the Forestry Commission field guide on soils, that's in essence the FC soil classification, and what is in ESC should match that one-to-one.
I suppose it's when you get in ESC, you have rich, very rich, you know, it's, I know we were trying to discuss whether it was worth having some kind of generalization, you know, if, I think the problem is when you're trying to look at new afforestation sites, you know, you go to an arable field, and you can't really tell It's trying to convert that into a soil fresque. It's come up numerous times.
Yeah. Okay, that is always tricky, and because obviously the soil has been altered, so it may be not recognizable other than that you can tell, well, it's freely draining and brown, or it's actually more grayish brown and probably therefore a bit wetter. One part of the system is you need to know the land use history, so you know what has happened. B, you may have to dig a bit deeper because usually if land has been cultivated by agricultural use, that has only happened to a certain depth. So if you dig deeper than the plow has been going year after year, you may actually find what is actually undisturbed soil structure and may be able to draw some conclusions there. And then there will always be the margins. So you just have to go to the side where say, okay, this is where the cultivation stopped. So there is a little bit of patch next to the roadside or somewhere where it shouldn't be disturbed by anything else, but also not by the agricultural practice. So I agree, you may have to get it's a bit like a jigsaw. So you may have to get your little pieces from different parts of it rather than from one central soil sample. So, but you should be able to establish or reconstruct what the soil type is.
Okay, Jens, thank you for that. I think I noticed in the chat some people are saying they can't see the answers. We'll try and sort that out as we go along and post the solution in the chat function. I think that's about it then, Jens, if you want to start the second half on cultivation techniques.
Yeah, will do.
Great, thanks everyone for those questions, and we'll have a second session on cultivation questions at the end.
Right. Okay, we've gone through the soil section, and the next point is obviously to look at the cultivation techniques that will achieve the objectives which we had identified. And well, this is usually on training courses is the better part because there's a lot of video clips here. So hopefully a bit less dried and slightly less talking from my part. Just to begin with, though, we can basically divide cultivation techniques into linear and non-linear ones. Linear ones, usually the cheaper ones, the more cost-efficient ones, and also the ones which are much more suitable to afforestation schemes because we have less or no obstacles like tree stumps or large boulders in the way. A lot of techniques can actually be applied both ways. So if you think about scarification, there are linear and non-linear options. The same applies to subsoiling, ripping, mulching. It's really plowing, which is a linear only technique, and mounding and scarification, which are really non-linear only. So looking at them in detail, starting with scarification. So this is not the most up-to-date picture, but it shows the principle quite nicely. A patch scarifier, or here it's called a cultivator, a flipping wheel with several blades, usually 3 these days. And the wheels, they dig in and they scrape off the turf and the surface vegetation from the soil, expose the mineral soil. So it's the purpose of this operation is really to remove ground vegetation, remove brush, expose the mineral soil, and create an individual planting position which is weed-free. I'm going to show you some video clips which show it used in a forestry context. Yeah, I hope this is quite good to see here, the wheels don't really dig any deep in the soil. They're supposed to scrape off the surface vegetation, and here the brush, because obviously that is a restock site. There's no point to go any deeper. The planting position is quite clearly, it's on the screeved or the scarified area. And what I find sometimes when seeing that in practice, at people being a bit obsessed with elevated planting positions, they use these things as mounders, which are not, is not the intention. So a common mistake or bad practice for scarification is to apply too much pressure on the wheel, so they dig up deeper, they bring up more soil. And remember, this mound, it should actually be just rolled up surface vegetation with accordingly large air gaps in there. And if you just have a bit more soil mixed in, that still doesn't necessarily make it a very good mound to plant on. So if we say a scarification, we really should mean scarification, and it is really exposing the mineral soil and planting in the mineral soil, not planting into the residue which we have removed from the planting position. Another example is an excavator on the picture here. It's a walking excavator, but any excavator should be able to do that using their bucket. So it's a superficial screeve or scarification, just using the bucket and the teeth to do exactly the same, scrape off the surface vegetation, any brush, and expose the mineral soil. It's not quite as straightforward, and I think success depends a bit on the operator's skill. If you think about excavators, they bring the bucket into themselves, and in order to fill it, when scarifying with an excavator, you need to do the exact opposite. So the bucket is actually pushed out so that it doesn't fill with anything, and the teeth are basically pushed away from the machine to create this screeve. And you can see that quite nicely here. So that is basically the vegetation, a bit of brush and a few stones which have been rolled up here, but it's a pushing movement, and it may not be the easiest things for excavator operators to get their head around, that they have to do exactly the opposite movement that they usually do when digging. But it is perfectly possible. And of course, you can do it manually. Usually a planting mattock is a very good option for that, but obviously the scale is rather limited. But scarifying manually, and you see quite nicely here, this is just the rolled up turf of the grass. So underneath, it's just the mineral soil. That is the purpose of scarification. There is a continuous, so there's a linear version of that, which is called continuous scarification. It does exactly the same. It can achieve a little bit of mixing between mineral soil, humus, and litter, but not too much. So basically, the main point is to expose the mineral soil. Disc scarifiers, so the modern Bracker machines, and they're really amazing bits of technology. They have their use and they do the job quite well. Again, there's a little bit of a video clip to illustrate how they work. So wheels are powered these days, so they move brush, turf, and vegetation sideways and create a continuous trace of exposed mineral soil. The wheels are movable. They can change. You can change the distance between the wheels. You can change the angle. You can change the speed of rotation. The modern ones, you can even make it an intermittent technique. So basically you can use the same machine as a nonlinear technique, because you can program the hydraulic arms to lift every meter or so. So quite important when it comes to sloping ground, where you say you don't want a continuous trace which may carry water. So they're really quite sophisticated. Tools, again, good and bad practice. What we really want from them is a shallow screeve, which means setting the wheel at a wide angle and a shallow angle, and basically having a lot of ground covered, so you get a wide trace and only a very shallow profile here where you put your tree in. Operators, unfortunately, for easing the strain on the machine, they prefer to having the disc set at a more acute angle to dig deeper and to create more of a ridge of outcast soil. And I guess that is, it may be easier on the machine, but that is not the point. Remember, again, the tree is supposed to go in here. You're not trying to create an elevated planting position. The tree is not even supposed to go at the shoulder. So this is, I've found that on a number of occasions where talking to the operator, oh yeah, look, I'll put that at a more acute angle and it makes it so much easier and I cover the ground faster. Well, I'm not interested in that. I want the quality of the work. So here again, a restock site, but it just shows what it should look like. So reasonably shallow. And the planting position really is at the bottom of the screeve. This is where the trees should be going. Moving on to ploughing, having been discussed very controversially, and not at least because our track history of ground cultivation. And first and foremost, coming from a continental background, I'm familiar with ploughing, but the way I look at it when I moved over to the UK, I thought, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Because I think we have a bit of a terminology issue here. We can talk about ploughing in different ways. So shallow ploughing, deep ploughing, that's probably the most common differentiation of techniques, but it's not really helpful because we don't really describe what exactly we are doing. And even the 30 centimeter depth line, well, this is just a rather arbitrary one. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily say that it's a quantum leap between the effects on the soil. We can look at the purpose, agricultural ploughing, forest ploughing, which is not useful at all. The best one is probably when we look at area and say, well, it's either strip ploughing or complete ploughing. And that is what I've used here, and basically combining it with depth. So in the top, we have both strip ploughing scenarios, shallow on the left, deep on the right. Basically, the point is we don't plough the entire area. We establish discrete strips of cultivated soil where at some locations which we use as planting locations. Whereas the two pictures as the bottom, they show complete ploughing where the entire soil is turned over. Again, on the left side, shallow, on the right-hand side, obviously a lot deeper. So that is the way I would look at ploughing, and I think it would be good for an informed discussion on the pros and cons of ploughing if we were clear about terminology and would make sure we all actually mean the same thing when we talk about, well, ploughing. Looking at these, the individual options in greater detail, so shallow strip ploughing, it really should expose the mineral soil and just remove the ground vegetation. So it is just, it's almost like scarification, just with a different tool. And consequently, what should be used is a forest plow. So modified agricultural plows, I know they have been used here, but I say that is mainly because of the lack of tradition in having forest plows. So I hope this clip makes it obvious what I mean when I say forest plow. This obviously is a cultivation scenario. You get a good idea how deep it actually cuts. This is hardly 15 centimeters underneath the surface. So it really just undercuts the grass roots and turns the soil over. So you end up with this very wide flat plow furrow, which now becomes the planting location. So really it is an alternative to scarification, and it really should be used on sandy mineral soil, where you say, well, this will be the droughtiest part, so you actually want to put the trees into the mineral part where most of the moisture is. It will have the added benefit that any post-cultivation soil erosion will actually wash the soil back to the lowest point. So all the nutrients which may be washed down, all the soil particles, they will actually be moved towards the tree rather than away from it. And as the picture below shows, you can even, if you really approach plowing like that, it's even possible in restock, and here even in an underplanting scenario where the plow has simply just turned the wavy hairgrass over and exposed the mineral soil. So all you really have done is put the raw humus with the grass over to make sure that the tree planters can put the trees into mineral soil. So this is an acceptable option on certain sites. So obviously, yeah, we'll have to pick the right, we have to bring the technique with the soils together later on. This is also shallow strip plowing, and well, I think the pictures speak for themselves. You see on the left-hand side, they had used a tine here. They also had used a tine here. They have planted the trees on the plow ridges. So I hope you can see the dead remnants of Douglas fir, which have died of desiccation, or the roots growing into air pockets. So shallow strip plowing, it needs to be used correctly. So the first and foremost, don't use it on slopes. Plowing is for flat ground. Don't use it for microsite drainage. If you aim to create a drained microsite, the plow ridge has never been designed for do that. But of course it is tempting if you look at the things short-term only, because yeah, the ridge will dry out. The furrow may actually carry and drain the water away. So you may think, oh, brilliant. It's I kill two birds with one stone, but the side effects can be enormous, particularly on slopes. You see it on the right-hand side. That was obviously a peaty clay being shallow plowed. Well, you can't plant anywhere. The soil has all but disappeared because it was mostly peat, which was in here, which has simply evaporated, and in here it is still waterlogged. So there are big mistakes to be made with strip plowing. So I would accept it as a technique, but only on the right sites and if done correctly. Deep strip plowing, I think that needs no more explanation. That is a thing of the past. We have done that, or we have used that successfully to establish forests on large upland areas with very peaty soils, and it has worked, but it has come at a high price, and we still struggle with the legacy. If you've been on one of those sites, you still have the furrows and the ridges in place, and you have very high stumps. So let alone the carbon sequestration and peat disturbance you have created there. So that is a no-no. Shallow complete plowing. It has, of course, a number of benefits. You remove the vegetation, you improve the soil aeration, you create good mixing, mineral, soil, humus, and litter. You get a complete area of weed-free planting positions where you can plant at will. So very easy. It's very good for mechanized planting. And I would say, yeah, it's a possible option, but the big question is it necessary? Particularly on afforestation sites, which if it's ex-agricultural land, we tend to look at the slightly better soils. So this will hardly be required. So I'm not saying never ever, but I can't really imagine many scenarios where we say this is the appropriate thing to do. And the same goes for deep complete plowing, which has the same effect. It has actually added effect because it can decompact the soil. It can deal with iron pans or with deeper laying plow pans. But again, there's hardly any need to do that on afforestation schemes. I can see very few cases where you say, oh no, this needs to be deep plowed in order to facilitate tree growth. So coming back to the fourfold terminology of plows, well, deep strip plowing definitely no longer applicable. Shallow strip plowing, if done correctly in some situations, and that need to be clear, this we're talking about sandy, gravelly mineral soils here, freely draining soils, where I'd say, yeah, this may be an option. The complete plowing, yeah, not necessarily. I wouldn't go as far as that. Shouldn't be done, but I don't see the necessity for it, at least not large scale. There may be the odd case. Right, moving on to subsurface treatments. So subsoiling, ripping, it is done, it has been designed to break hard pans, can aerate compacted soils, so heavy clay soils, very useful tool there. None with a subsoil or winged ripper, certainly on afforestation sites. On restock sites, you use different tools, but you have alternative there. Not going to show you much of this, just there's not much to see on the surface, but obviously not a lot of disturbance, not a lot of soil movement. It all happens underground. So the idea is really to shatter the either the pan or aerate lower lying compacted soil layers. Mounding has a number of benefits. It removes ground vegetation, brush, it exposes mineral soil, it can mix mineral soil with humus and litter, so you get a weed-free, more or less elevated individual planting position. And I've put that yellow box in here to warn against negative side effects. The positive effects, they are very clear, and there's ample research about that. The mound, yeah, it's a bit drier, it's a bit warmer, so you get better root growth initially. The long-term effects are, they can be very negative. Earlier last year, we got the results from a study on trench mounding commissioned by Forestry and Land Scotland, where trench mounding has been the dominant technique for cultivation. And after 25 years, we really looked at sites and we found that the trenches are still there and they're just as big as they used to be when they were freshly established. The mounds are still there and they're just as high as they were after establishment. So we are creating features which won't go away. So often it's associated with the idea, oh yeah, by the time we do the final harvesting on the site, the trench will have gone and you won't notice the mounds. Well, certainly 25 years later, we found the mounds are still there and the trenches are there, and there's absolutely no sign of them filling in, even if they had been filled in with coarse harvesting residue. And it is also clear that they pose an obstacle to machine use. So there is the long-term negative effects of mounding. You come across them when you come back to the site and want to thin it and find your machines can't move freely. So positive as mounding is short-term. It has negative side effects, a lot of them, which may actually outweigh the positive benefits on balance. There's three general techniques: hinge mounding, where you create shallow borrow pits immediately next to the mounds; trench mounding, where you get the soil from a borrow trench; and inverted mounding, where you create a borrow pitch like in hinge mounding, but then you fill the place back in with the soil. So you get a shallower mound and obviously no lasting borrow pit. So that's the three general techniques. If you look at they're all effective. They're not necessarily all equally efficient. So when you talk operators into trying inverted mounding, immediately there's a bit of resistance. That's too difficult and the stumps are in the way. Well, it's no different than hinge mounding. It may take a little bit longer, and initial studies suggested, yes, it is the output is a bit lower and therefore there's slightly higher costs involved. But when you look at the long-term environmental effects, inverted mounding fares best compared to the other two options. So I've put this table here with the traffic light systems. No matter where you look at, creating a good planting medium, less soil disturbance, future access problems, restricting root growth, risk of desiccation, suitability for slopes. This is where inverted mounding is definitely the best. It is not quite so good in terms of creating a drained planting position. But as I said earlier, there's only so much that you can achieve by cultivation. And if you have a drainage issue on a site, then it needs to be addressed by drainage and not by a cultivation where you think, oh yeah, you can save the money for drainage by planting trees on drained microsites. So there is, at the moment, well, there's anecdotal feedback from the practice, which is a bit mixed, I have to say, on the virtues or benefits of inverted mounding. If you look at scientific literature, the benefit is actually positive. Wherever people look at inverted mounding more large scale, they find actually the tree survival rates are better. Another alternative to mounding is, another technique of mounding is using the Continuous Mandem, and this brings us very close to the patch scarifier. Only this time the idea is to dig a bit deeper and to create a mound. And we need to be very clear, is this what we want, or do we want scarifying? And it shouldn't be somewhere in between. It should be dependent on site conditions, where we said on scarification, we want to expose mineral soil by scraping off the vegetation and plant the trees. For the continuous mounding, we actually now want to create a mound made out of the soil. There are a couple of pitfalls here. The vegetation needs to be fairly short. So, or if it's very tall, it needs to be removed, because you can imagine if you roll up tall vegetation and stiff vegetation like heather or rushes, you will actually end up with mounds containing air gaps, which is not good for root growth. So it's you still need to make sure you can't just go and mound a site. So you may have to look at what's growing on there, and you need to deal with the existing vegetation first. But other than that, this is now a mounding technique, and the tree should go on the mound. It does, on afforestation side, I can clearly see the benefits. It's quick establishment, it's easy, it's a very cost-efficient technique. I would still say it comes with all the long-term disadvantages of mounds. So you end up with little molehills with your trees sticking out of them, and they're usually surrounded by 4 holes, which in wet times fill with puddles. And depending on the soil texture, the mounds are not likely to go away. So all the mounding sites I've seen, and really the oldest ones I've seen, were 25 years old, the mounds will still be there, as will be the holes. So it just requires a bit of a long-term thinking and anticipation of what you're actually doing to the soil relief and how you imagine future forest operations happening on the site. Mulching is a reasonably modern technique, and obviously what you do with mulching, you can break up harvesting residue into small particles, which is a benefit on a lot of restock sites. You can mix them with litter and topsoil, and you get fairly straightforward and easy to plant strips. Machines are mulchers. They can be dedicated horizontal shaft flails, which are machine mounted, or smaller ones which are mounted to the booms of excavators. I was a bit too impatient here. Video clip just to illustrate how mulches work. Yeah, again, there is light and shadow, or light and shade are close together. Mulches, they give you a very neat planting medium. They are very good at mixing organic matter. That obviously has the effect of speeding up the nutrient release from the organic matter. And that in itself may pose a bit of a problem, because the moment the nutrients, if you accelerate nutrient remineralization from the organic layer, the nutrients which become available, if the trees are not in place, a lot of the nutrients will be lost. The carbon is likely to go up in the atmosphere, and a lot of the macro and micronutrients are likely to be leached away. So the problem with mulching is it's almost too good of a thing for the trees, and we're providing too much, and the availability of nutrients is a bit too much that the trees can cope with. But by and large on some sites, and if it's done correctly, so I think the secret with mulching is to limit it, not to mulch vast swathes of area, but really just mulching the planting positions, which of course makes it a slower and therefore more costly operation. Right, so much as a quick run through the techniques. And then of course the big task is to link them to the situation we find on site. So in order, in essence, to pick the right technique for the right soil. And straight away, I would warn against any generalization. We have lists like that where you may look at it and say, okay, yeah, manual screefing, volume disturbed soils, negligible, and then you have agricultural plowing, 2,500 cubic meters per hectare. So you quite clearly have this traffic light system, say that's the good, that's the not so good, and that's the bad ones. It is nowhere nearly as simple as that. So for a start, well, with this particular table, I would seriously question some of the figures. Some of them look familiar, others are downright contradictory to figures I know from research that has been carried out. And then, of course, the level of soil disturbance really depends on the technique chosen, yes, but then the operating depth, how really do you go with your scarifying disc? How deeply do you go with your patch scarifier? Good and bad practice. So how good is your operator? What's the soil texture like? So what is really the risk for subsequent erosion? What's the terrain? Are you on a slope? Are you on a flat? What's the operation design? So how many scarifying rows or plowing strips are you actually establishing per hectares? And not at least, if you think carbon dioxide release, it depends on the carbon content of the soil. So what may be a no-no in terms of carbon release on a carbon-rich soil may be perfectly acceptable on a soil where you say, well, that is a mineral soil with no carbon layer on top, so we need to be less worried there. So I've come up with a general matrix trying to link soil types or soil groups with the most common cultivation techniques. Carbon content of soil, the little gray to black strips try to illustrate how much carbon is in the soil. Obviously on brown earth, not a lot. On pot soil, could be up to 45 centimeters. The same is true for iron pans. Glaze, we said up to 5 centimeters, so there is usually very limited. Peaty glaze could be more, and deep peats, well, they have carbon all across the soil profile. And then, of course, we have the drainage of the soil. So brown earth, pot soils, the freely draining ones. Iron pan, by definition, freely draining soils, although we know the topsoil is actually waterlogged, and glaze and the peats waterlogged. And on the top of the matrix, we have the intensity of cultivation methods, least intensive, no cultivation, and I've put here deep, complete plowing as the most intensive one. And then the chart uses a system of plus signs. So 3+ are the recommended best practice, 2+ possible alternative, 1+ acceptable under certain circumstances. And I must say this has been written as provisional guidance, but I don't see any. I think the rationale is fairly sound. I would stick to that, and it has been approved, and it is basically now, this matrix is pretty much used by Forestry and Land Scotland as a decision-making tool for their cultivation of restock sites. And straight away, no cultivation, I say that that will feature reasonably strongly on almost all scenarios. So no cultivation, that is something we seem to have forgotten, or maybe never even considered properly in the UK, whereas elsewhere in the forest, it's quite obvious, yeah, cultivation, that is an exception, whereas here it seems to be the rule. Other than that, brown earth, we said, well, what we had to do possibly is address the weed growth, so scarification methods, and oddly enough, it's on the poorer sites where it's actually thought to be more acceptable than on the richer sites. The reason simply being, if you disturb a fertile brown earth, you're likely to activate the weed bank or seed bank in the ground. So, and you can actually see that on arable land where you say this was just grass. The moment you start cultivating where you have cultivated, this is where the more aggressive weeds, where the thistles and the more large leaf, the beefier herbs come in, which pose more of a danger to trees. So a bit counterintuitive that actually cultivation is more acceptable on the poorer brown earth, whereas on the rich ones, we should ideally not do anything and really just plant and address the weed as a weed problem as such, rather than by cultivation. On potholes, no cultivation is an option, but usually a bit of mixing of the mineral soil with the humus layer helps with tree establishment. So shallow options like scarification, mulching are usually quite good. Inverted mounding can be an option. I'm not saying it's necessary, but at least it's unlikely to be any harmful. With iron pan soils, I've made a distinction here for the benign iron pan soils where the pan is, yeah, it just causes a bit of a perched water table, but it's not really strong enough to limit root growth, whereas the proper ones do limit root growth. And obviously those are the ones where either subsoiling or inverted moundings are the best options to really deal with the problems, because you address all other problems by breaking the pan with those. There is a third category where the pan simply is not within reach for our cultivation. So a lot of the upland soils where you look at them and say, oh, that's a peaty clay, or it's even a deep peat. The underlying reason is actually an iron pan, but the pan is buried 2 meters below the surface, so you can't get to it. So those need to be treated like glaze, peaty glaze, deep peats accordingly, depending on what you find on the surface. Rankers and skeletal soils, well, I said early on, they should not be cultivated at all. The two plus signs here, if you look at the asterisk, it means manual methods only. They are acceptable, but anything mechanized on a ranker or a skeletal soil is not acceptable. On glaze soils, it's a bit like brown earth, distinguishing between the poorer and medium fertility glaze and the rich or very rich glaze. And again, no cultivation is a preferable option. Inverted mounding or, well, hinge mounding, even trench mounding, mulching, patch scarification, all acceptable. It all depends how wet the soil really is, how much of a mound is required, how much weed growth there is, and it's the same principle with brown earth. Actually, the more fertile glaze, the recommendation is to do less cultivation because you're likely to stir up the weeds. The subsoiling ripping, that is for clay soils only, where on afforestation side it has shown to be beneficial for soil aeration to actually run a winged ripper through clay soils if they are very heavy clay loams. And then we have the PT glaze, where no cultivation may be an option. Inverted mounding, if we think we can't wait with a bit longer for trees to get established, if we want to speed it up, then yeah, the best thing is to create a freely drained microsite or better drained microsite. I think inverted mounding is the best way to go because it minimizes the disturbance of the soil. It has the least long-term negative effects. And the peats, well, for afforestation sites, that is not an actual question because we're not planting on those. For restock sites, again, no cultivation is best. Inverted mounding, if we really insist that cultivation needs to be happen, is probably the next best option. But as I said, it's not really a topic for afforestation schemes. Right, and that is the last step, or well, not the last step, but step 5 of our initial decision-making process. So far, we have taken on board really the soil-related issues. I'm not going to read through the yellow text box, but it is obvious we need to take on board other considerations as well. So there is terrain, there is machine availability, capability, labor, skills, variability of the soil on site. So there's a number of wider climatic, topographic, economic reasons that need to be taken on board. And I'm just going to look at a few of them. Soil texture so far has been rather neglected, but obviously soil texture is hugely important for erosion and soil compaction. So we have our famous soil texture triangle, which again we can simplify and just speak of sandy soils, loamy soils, and clayey soils, and they all have their do's and don'ts with regard to disturbance, erosion, risk. Sandy soils, the most liable to erosion. Both wind and water can have devastating effects there. They're also the most droughty soils. Clay soils at the other end of the extreme, very good water holding capacity, but very sensitive to compaction, very delicate structures, so they are very sensitive with regard to any intensive cultivation. So clay soils, once you disturb the soil structure, that will possibly never, or at least not in the tree's lifetime, re-establish itself. Not so much of an erosion risk if you don't count turbidity and water. Loamy soils somewhere in the middle, so they suffer at both ends. So they are erodible and they lead to water siltation, and they also are sensitive to compaction. Slopes, particularly relevant for linear techniques where slopes obviously, if the technique is applied the wrong way, carries an immense risk of erosion. So conclusion should be linear techniques really on flat ground, and if applied on slopes, then along the contour lines. And if that is not operationally safe, then linear techniques should not be running up and down the slopes. And the two, well, it's the same side here. You can't help thinking about why on earth was there need to plow a brown earth on just a grassy slope, rather than what was wrong with just planting trees in there and mowing the grass as long as necessary. There's a bit of guidance on the erosion risk on slope. It obviously goes with the gradient of the slope and with the soil texture. So clay soils least at risk, sandy gravelly soils most at risk. Some consideration, again, that is particularly relevant for linear techniques where we produce continuous traces of planting position, the planting density and spacing pattern. And again, we seem to be a bit hooked up in the UK on a square 2 by 2 meter spacing. If you apply this and imagine you want, for being a convenient example, 2,500 planting positions, so that gives you 2 by 2 meter spacing. If you do that, you need, if you imagine your plow or your scarification lines, you have one every 2 meters. That gives you 50 lines per hectare or per 100 running meters. If you change your spacing, still using 2,500 trees, but space them at 1.6 by 2.5 meter spacing, your planting lines now are at 2.5 meter spacing, which means you need only 40 per 100 running meters. So without changing anything other than your spacing, you have reduced your soil disturbance by 20%. And I think that is highly relevant for afforestation scenarios. And it also brings added benefits if you think about future forest operations. First thinning, you take out one row of trees, you now have an almost 5 meter gap for your machine to operate safely, opposed then an almost 4 meter gap in the 2 by 2 meter scenario. Just a bit of food for thought. I'm not going triangular spacing, it's there for completeness, but it is basically square spacing turned by 45 degrees. So linear techniques, they actually offer some potential to reduce disturbance if a different spacing patterns is applied. Right, and the last one is really the presence of multiple soil types, which I alluded to at the beginning of this presentation. It puts us in a difficult position because we have to come up with various methods, because different soils may require different technologies and techniques, and it also requires the operators or the contractors to realize when do they have to change techniques. And in general, it favors the more versatile machines, so which are often the least cost efficient ones. So you may have to use an excavator rather than a tractor with a plow or a four-wheeler with a disc scarifier, because the excavator can actually use, can do different tools. So they can mount, they can screeve, they can deal with brush. They can use different tools, so they can switch between different buckets. They can possibly attach a mulcher, a grapple on the same machine. The downside is it's all no good if the operator hasn't bought into the principle and isn't switched on enough to actually look at what's going on and basically apply best practice. And I've tried to illustrate that here with my 5 mount charts, assuming that an operator would be, in an excavator, would be given the instruction to look at the site and basically start with mounding, as long as the mounts they produce are gray. Well, we're mounting a glaze soil, so there's fundamentally nothing wrong with it. The moment the mounds turn bicolor, so gray and black, it's a peaty clay, and inverted mounding would be the better option to basically have this mixed rooting medium back in that bowl where it came from, to limit carbon release and to make tree establishment long-term a bit more stable. If the mounds turn black all over, well, we are in peat only and mounding should stop, or it needs to be inverted, and then on top of the inverted mound, the mounds need to be consolidated so we don't end up with air pockets underneath the mounds. If the mounds appear tricolor, so orange, gray and black, then we either have a podzol or an iron pan. And well, if it's an iron pan, ripping would be the better option. If it's a podzol, scarification might do, but in either case, inverted mounding would actually be doing no harm. For an iron pan, inverted mounding would actually be the method of choice. And the moment the mounds turn brown, the operator should have the wits to say, well, for brown earth, what am I creating an elevated planting position for? Scraping, scarifying will do. Right, and these was just a selection of issues, and I think Chris made that case to one of the comments that this looks at the technical and the soil related part of the decision-making process. What should we do? Where should we do it? How should we do it? So there are other considerations which all need to find their way into the woodland creation plan and what is hopefully best practice. Right, and with that, we have reached the end of the presentation. So I'll hand over to Chris to lead us through the Q&A session.
Hey, thanks, Jens. That was another brilliant technical session. Yeah, just to reiterate what Jens was saying, what we would say is if your operator starts to see bucket loads of peat coming up, he stops and goes and says, am I really supposed to be even operating on this site? So it is about training your operator as well. Okay, I know John's been answering a lot of these questions as they've been going along. Jens, Shona before she left said, you know, when she was going back to her example of trying to input soil types into ESC, an example might be a podzolic iron pan, whether this is a podzol with an indurated phase or an iron pan soil with a podzolic phase. I mean, I think what that shows is we all have to become a lot more expert on soils, really. Somebody else was mentioning spades. I now have a spade permanently in the back of the car and a copy of the soils ID guide. You know, Jens, I don't know what else you can say on that, really.
Yeah, I quite agree. This is, the soil is the medium we grow our trees in. That's our main means of production. So we know that, we have to know that off by heart. There is no, if you are a forester and don't know your soils, you will fail, to put it quite simply. You'll have to, and you really have to know them fairly intimately. You don't need to be a soil surveyor, you don't need to be an expert, but you need to know what they are. You need to be able to identify them and to assess the implications on tree growth. Forestry, unlike agriculture, which is a very intensive form of land use, agriculture is not thinkable without intensive cultivation, without extensive use of fertilizer. Forestry is an extensive land use form. We are supposed to work in line with nature. So we don't have the option of chucking X amount of fertilizers on trees. Our production cycles are far too long. So we really need to know what we're working with. And yeah, as a forester, the spade should be one of your most important tools. And also you can't rely on soil maps alone. Even the sophisticated soil maps which we have, I still hammer that in to my delegates at all training, because you need to go out and ground truth. The surveyor may have made a mistake, the soil survey may have happened 50 years ago and things have changed because you had 1.5 rotation of Sitka spruce unthinned there. So what used to be a surface water clay is now a PT clay. So you need to be out there. And the moment you actually are out there, it also makes the use of ESC a lot easier, because you don't necessarily have to use the very accurate soil type and soil phases. If you know the site, you need to come to a conclusion: how wet is it, how fertile is it, and what is the soil type, and what is the rooting depth. That is the main thing. And ESC has one of the benefits of ESC, it gives you several layers. So you can actually go by the default, which is never advisable because that is based on very coarse map-based modeling. But then you can input the SNR and the SMR directly, and that is definitely the way I would say, an experienced forester, this is where we need to be. Yeah, the other options, yeah, calling in podzollic iron pan, yes, you can do that, but basically I can skip that jump in my head. I know if it's a podzollic iron pan, I need to give it a very poor, and I'm giving it a moist, or maybe a fresh to moist. And that's what I'm going to put in ESC. So we don't have to make things overcomplicated.
No, great. Lee Hollings asked, I have a lot of new greenfield sites to plant with large populations of field voles, trying to reduce plastic and vole guards. Do you think any particular form of ground prep may reduce tree damage by voles? Thinking of mowing the sites, pre-planting and scarifying as most suitable method for soils and species?
Yeah, I would, yeah, obviously the kind of forest pests such as voles and habitat, my preferred option would be to address that by habitat management, and that would be, yeah, mechanical weeding. You can use other, I mean, you can have those predator poles. Again, planting density can actually be quite important there, and I've seen good examples. By increasing plant density, it means by tighter spacing, it means the ground is covered. So canopy closes much more quickly and shades out the vegetation. It's mostly seen in the kind of oak cluster planting. There's one good example here near Dumfries, where oak was established at 50 centimeter spacing, but obviously not across the entire site, just in distinct groups, and within 3 or 4 years the oak had closed canopy and the grass around the oak clusters had completely gone. So basically the trees had looked after themselves within 3-4 years, and basically taken away the habitat for the voles.
I know the only sites where I've seen horrendous vole damage, they've basically practiced a really heavy herbicide control to create open space around each tree, and then predator poles, as you say, which did work, to be honest. But talking of wildlife, Alan Rowe asks, has the impact of mounding on wildlife ever been studied?
Oh, not that I'm aware of. Well, what kind of wildlife is Alan thinking about?
I don't know. I don't know if Alan's still on. He might better reply. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly been on mounding sites where there's a little pond by the side of each one, yeah, which probably wasn't the intended thing to happen, but I'm guessing it's lovely for frogs and things.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I can see that. But again, I would say that is, it just adds up to what I said about the different kinds of mounding and best and not so good practice. So yeah, the moment you create a little and deep and steep-sided borrow pits, I can see that that does create an issue to wildlife. It also that creates an issue to human access and pedestrian access later on. And all I can say is really, well, that's another thing you avoid by inverted mounding, because you don't have these features there.
He's just replied, actually, was really nesting birds on the ground. I mean, it's another constraint that we look at on afforestation sites, Alan, anyway, is are they in a wading bird zone? So there is kind of constraints anyway if you are in those sort of curlew areas. Richard Claxon made a comment. For effective flood alleviation by afforestation in upland water catchment areas, rapid establishment and continuous high water uptake are indeed desirable. This is concomitant with high yield species, and productivity is certainly not undesirable. Not so sure that's a question as such, but yeah, we agree.
Well, yeah, there's nothing to disagree about. We all know that the water uptake or the flood mitigation is actually better in conifers than it is in broadleaf. So there are good arguments for productive forestry. I'm not against that at all.
Yeah, I'll just see, I know John answered a lot. I know we're nearly at the end anyway. Hopefully Richard Bellamy was talking about ploughing along contours, but you mentioned that, didn't you, Jens, that it should really be along the contours where safe to do so. And I guess if it's not safe, it's almost why are you ploughing, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. If you can't contour plough, you don't plough at all.
Yeah.
That would be my line on this.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're nearly, there was a lot of talk about carbon, and that really is what has created the interest for us to produce this this webinar, and particularly with regards to peat. So we'll have a thinking on that and see if there's any more we can talk about on those, but take a look at those new guidance documents that Forest Research have just released. I can't really think of anything else to add, Jens. Thank you once again for this. It's been brilliant. We'll send out a copy of Jens's technical development job report on a field guide to soil cultivation. Claire will send that along with a short survey and our guidance document. Please, if you could answer the survey, that would be brilliant. Many thanks to Claire Street for organising this and the RFS, and obviously thanks to Jens. Thank you.